So in a prior video, we looked at how we could end up using uh, form controls as uncontrolled components. Um, we've got these components, and again, a little bit of a contrived example, but we can imagine that we'd be getting this data from the server. And what I'm going to do now is switch this up to a controlled component. So I'm going to change this. And well, first of all, why would we want to have a controlled component? Well, maybe one reason would be that instead of things changing immediately when you change the select, maybe what we want to do is we want to have a button here that says save, and maybe we don't want that button to be enabled unless the value has ended up changing. So if we decided to do that, we're going to end up needing some state because we're going to have to determine what this value is, not the passed-in value, but what the user is changing the select value to. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn this into a class component. So this is going to be a class because I need state. And you can't have state with a presentational component. This is going to extend react.component. And this is now going to end up becoming my render method. Let's move this down here. Let's move this over. And the only thing that I'm going to do is just do a little destructuring here, because now that this is coming in this way, in order to get my item, I'll say my item, both my item and my value for the moment, just to keep this the same way, is going to be coming from the props. And excuse me, I really don't need the value. I really just need my on change. So this is going to be the same as we had before. I just end up now having a class component. I'm not really taking advantage of it. Let me actually take this save button out real quickly. So we've got controlled components. This should work really the exact same way as I had before. Now, what I want to do here is that I'm going to want to take this value and have a controlled component. So I'm going to put the constructor in here. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I want to get the value that this is set to, and I want to end up getting it from the props that end up getting passed in here. So I'm going to, on my constructor, I'm going to call super. One thing that I want to do is I want to access the props here, and if you want to do that, you want to access the props with this dot props. I'm going to pass in props here, and I'm going to pass in props here, and I'm just to show you, I'm going to console log this dot props. Nothing really is going to end up changing here, but I will see the props that get passed in. Let me just see what I'm missing here for a second. Always good to spell constructor correctly. I think that's right. Let's see. Okay, so this is what's being passed in here as the props. By the way, if you don't end up passing this in to super, you won't end up seeing it. So that's just a little caveat that's here. Let's pass in props. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set the state. So the only, again, it's important to know what's changing. Well, what's changing is what's going to be in the drop-down list. So I'm going to put in the value, and the value that's coming in here is going to be this dot props dot item dot value. That's going to be my state. And so I've got my item and my on change. And now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say I'm going to get the value from this dot state. And what I'm going to end up doing here is that I'm going to change this. So I'll say value, and this is the value that I'm getting from the state. And one of the things that I probably want to end up doing here is that if in fact I want to control this, maybe putting a button that says save and saying, hey, look, we're going to disable this button if in fact the item's value is the same as the value that's in the state. There's no need to save anything if in fact you haven't ended up changing anything. So if we rerun this, we'll find that this button ends up being disabled for the moment. So we're going to modify our onChange. So sort of a standard thing that we end up doing here. Let's modify this onChange. And let's just worry about the value that's in the component. Let's get that button to become enabled. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to say onChange. And we're going to get this onChange from this object. This doesn't exist right now. We do have props, but we want to basically take care of the state within this component. So we're going to do some binding here. We'll say this onChange equals this onChange dot bind this, and we'll go in for our onChange, and we're going to do our sort of standard this set state. We could hard code this, but we could also make it a little bit more variable by saying ev.target.name, ev.target.value. And let's just go and give this select object a name, and the value that we're changing in our state happens to be called value. So we're just controlling the state change that's here, and what we should end up seeing, if we rerun this, duplicate declaration onChange. Oh, that's correct, because we have onChange on props over here. I'm going to take that out. I'm going to use it a little bit later on, but this is, again, the onChange for this particular component. So if I go over here now, the big takeaway is that when I do change these things, right, I could end up seeing this save button as being enabled. And traditionally, for this to be sort of semantically a little bit more correct, we'll take this and we'll end up putting this inside of a form. Let's move this in. And let's put an onSubmit, and we'll have a onSave. And so we've got our onChange, which takes care of this component. But let's also do onSave, which, again, doesn't exist yet. And we'll go over here, and we'll say onSave. And we want to make sure that since this is on a form, we'll specify ev prevent default. And let's also grab that onSave from this. So there's a lot more work that you have to do with a controlled component, but it gives us a little bit more power as well. And so now we shouldn't really see anything happening. We'll just see that this button becomes active, and we click on save, and nothing happens after that. But in fact, what we can end up doing here is now we've got the ability to call this props onChange. So this is now the onChange that's happening farther up the line where we're changing the state of our application. And we'll call this .props onChange. And what do we need to pass in? Same thing as we did before. We actually didn't change that component. So we're going to pass in this .props.item. And we also want to pass in the value. And we're going to end up getting the value from this .props.state.value. So we've got a controlled component. That means whatever values we're getting, they're values that are on the state. And it gives us a little bit more control. Hence, it's a controlled component. And now if we go back over here, we can end up saving these values. And let's just see what this is. Can I read property value of undefined? So I have this incorrectly. It's not this prop state. It's just this .state.value. And let's test this out. So we could see these things end up changing. And we've got a little bit more control over the component, a little bit more work, a little bit more control. You have to decide what's the scenario. Do you need to have a controlled form component or don't you? And you'll run into both these circumstances pretty frequently.